So, welcome back, everybody. Here we are with a new session of our conference, and we have Wendy Skays, University of Birmingham, professor for medieval English literature, right? Okay. And so the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to this conference, which I'm finding extremely interesting. I come at this subject. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? Okay. Can you hear me anyway? Because I'll carry on. Yes. There's not much time. I come at this subject as a medieval manuscript specialist. I'm not a graffitologist, a word I picked up this morning. I think I'm going to use that in future. I'm not, but I've been looking at some graffiti in relation to writing in Britain more broadly. So I'm going to be talking about manuscripts and graffiti in medieval parish churches in Britain, so little rural parish churches. Parish churches in Britain are, am I now amplified? You can hear me? Yeah. Parish churches in Britain are a rich source of historical graffiti. In England alone, there are some 13,000 medieval parish churches. We're talking about humble little buildings in the countryside. The following slides, which I'm going to show you, represent the main kinds of medieval graffiti found in them. My categories are for organisational purposes only. In practice, these categories overlap. The photographs are all my own or taken with the help of my husband, who's around at the dinners. Yes, I must apologise for the quality because they were just taken on without specialist lighting or photographic equipment. And so sometimes I'm afraid they're not always clear. Right, this is the first category. So these apotropaic marks and religious symbols are broadly symbols that ward off evil. And I've selected some examples there. You can see the symbol that's like on top left, a sort of double V or a W, or sometimes it's up the other way. It looks like an M. Some Christian crosses, some compass drawn designs. Down below, another one of these M symbols, more compass designs, and finally a pentangle. I think those are probably all religious symbols or symbols to ward off evil. Decorative devices, very hard to distinguish from the evil warding off symbols because basically they're formed in the same way. Possibly some of these are also supposed to ward off evil. Here's some examples, some free drawn. So on your left at St Mary Great Bardfield, or drawn with compasses, as at Finchingfield. Some linear design at St Mary Coolidge in Suffolk, and some rather fine plat designs. And finally, on the far right, a rather crude compass design from Ashwell in Hertfordshire. There are also figurative images. So just a selection here, a rather fine ox head from Finchingfield, a rather crude human figure from Ridgewell. In the middle, at the top, I don't know if you can see it, there's an outline of a hand. Can you see that? Then a couple of rather nice windmills, both from Lydgate in Suffolk. Bottom line, a drawing of a church. It's obviously inscribed. It's not really a drawing, but it's a church building. A hound next to that. A ship. I don't know if you can see the ship terribly well. Moving bottom, second right at the bottom. And finally, a rather dandy man with a fine bit of headgear and a beard and I think good hair. So that's just a sample of figurative images. Heraldic devices, we've already heard a lot about heraldic devices. Just a few examples, they're obvious, they're shields, but sometimes I think some of the images I've shown you which look figurative are actually heraldic. So like the hound, you know, often features in heraldic context and so on. Going on to text, here are some of the types of text that one finds in this corpus. So top left, there's a name from St Mary Great Bardfield. Across the top, a historical memorandum. It actually it records the date of a plague and the date of a great wind. So this is the kind of thing that I think people are calling chronicle graffiti, very rare in the British context. Bottom row on the left, a prayer. In the middle, a moral verse. I'm going to come back to some of these. A religious tag at St Mary Coolidge again. And finally, bottom right, just the letter T, a rather fine letter T. I think you'll agree it's the majuscule letter T from St Mary Lydgate, Suffolk. So I'm now going to talk about this material in relation to manuscript marginalia. And I'm going to argue that this material in the churches has a lot in common with the marginalia one finds in medieval manuscript books, particularly those that we can attribute to, you might say, sort of amateur scribes, scribe writing for their household, scribe writing for their family. I'm going to say that I think it's useful to think about the two locations of inscription, the margins of the page, the church, as evidence for a community's graphic culture. But first, what do I mean by marginalia? What you see on the slide is a picture of a page from a manuscript of a poem called Confessio Amantis by John Gower. All of the things circled in red are, you might say, in the margins, but I'm not counting them as marginalia, except for the item on the bottom right. And that's in a later hand. The person hasn't even written straight on the line. It's completely random, and it's crucially the page has not been prepared to receive that bit of marginalia. But the rest, the page has all been ruled and so on, prepared. So that's my distinction. I'm saying marginalia is something that's not been, the page has not been prepared for. Now, marginalia, the kind of material that one finds in marginalia in manuscript books, has on occasion been compared with graffiti, quite loosely, I think. Here's an example. This is a very famous manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Ellesmere manuscript, and this is one of the fly leaves, and you can see that there's a lot of sort of short inscriptions there, and there's a blog post about this particular manuscript on the Huntington Library website, which is where the manuscript's held. And Vanessa Wilkie refers to these fly leaves that are covered in this marginal supply as graffiti-filled fly leaves, but she doesn't really pick up on the connections or any connections really with medieval graffiti. I think it's more just a broad term. So that's what I'm going to be trying to do today, to think about this kind of material in relation to the graffiti in the parish churches. First, though, very quickly, I'm going to talk about just a little bit of an overview about the study of the graffiti in the medieval parish church in Britain. As far as I know, it goes back to Coulton, who wrote a very famous article, Medieval Graffiti, especially in the Eastern Counties. That's 1915. In 1967, Violet Pritchard published this book, which is still available and is terrific, although highly imaginative, it's not entirely reliable, but she went through a lot of churches, again in the east of England. She and I think Coulton were both based in Cambridge, and they basically went to places that you could get a lift to or a bike ride to, and they visited the churches. So there's Pritchard. In 2015, things changed when Matthew Champion published this work, Medieval Graffiti, The Lost Voices of England's Churches. And Champion's work was associated with a lot of survey projects, so recent survey projects. And that's just one of their, there's a website, there's the URL, and on the map you can see the administrative counties of England that have already been surveyed. And the surveys are done by local enthusiasts, citizen scientists, who go out and record what they can find. Unfortunately, if you pursue some of this, you'll find that the websites are no longer functioning even now, which is very sad. But anyway, this is what Matthew Champion's work inspired, this kind of renewed interest in graffiti and sort of mass survey of it. So Champion's work has reorientated understanding of graffiti. Coulton and Pritchard, though neither of them was a manuscript scholar, often focused on text. They were interested in text and pointed to commonalities between writing in books and the graffiti on walls. I have to say some of their comparisons are a bit wild, I think, but anyway, they do make those comparisons. But Matthew Champion, the recent leader of graffiti studies, has roundly dismissed any comparison with manuscript marginalia. And so what he says here is the types of graffiti recorded in a medieval context have been superficially compared to the marginalia of medieval manuscripts. Both may reflect an informality of approach, but direct comparisons are few and far between. And then he seems to refer to the kind of imagery that one often finds in the borders of medieval manuscripts. I think that's what he's saying. He says the graffiti images are much simpler and they're more everyday, but the crucial difference is that the vast majority of inscriptions in medieval graffiti appear to have a spiritual aspect with clear devotional or votive connotations. When he talks about text, it gets really alarming. He says the majority are in heavily abbreviated and contracted Latin and do not follow the usual conventions associated with text written on parchment and paper. I don't think that's right. They are in Latin, but a lot of them, and they can be contracted, but I think he is not right to say that they don't follow the normal conventions. In many instances, the texts are so contracted as to be only understandable by the individual who wrote them. It's also been suggested that some were not designed to be read in the first place. They were simply a mysterious and enigmatic text. One could hope that would be right. You wouldn't have to try to read them, but I don't think so. Anyway, and then he goes on to say what he thinks these inscriptions are, all of the graffiti. They're the outcome of direct and personal physical interactions between the members of the later medieval congregation and the fabric of the building. So they're the physical manifestation of lay piety. They go beyond really the sort of institution of the church. They bypass the traditional hierarchies of the church. And that's, I think, why he refers to or subtitles his book, The Lost Voices of the Medieval Church, because he thinks that the graffiti gives voice to voices which have been lost. Okay, so I'm going to go back now very quickly, a little bit more detail into comparing some manuscripts with some of the text types and image types that we saw. So I'm going to compare just with two manuscripts. They're both manuscripts that were copied by provincial copyists in the 15th, turn of the 16th century, one by someone who signed himself Rate, we don't know who he was, and someone who's called Humphrey Newton, who helpfully signs his name all the time. So we know what he's responsible for. And I've given you just two examples. You can see on the very long, thin manuscript at the bottom, there's a fish. He puts fishes all over in random places in his manuscript. And Humphrey Newton, well, his manuscript is just a wild kind of, almost like a set of graffiti palimpsests. And you can see an example page there, bottom right. So going back to text types, names are really common, as we've already heard from other speakers. Here's an example of the name Framlingham, which is found at Great Bardfield. Framlingham is a village I've shown you on Google Maps, about 60 miles from Great Bardfield. I think it must be a personal name, somebody who takes the name of the village they came from. Here's some more personal names. I think William, John Clare, Johannes Clare, Aylmere, I think is probably, again, a place in Norfolk, so not in Suffolk, but somebody who's taking a name from another village. And of course, manuscripts are absolutely full of names. And just here's some of the Humphrey Newton's signatures, and in Rate's manuscripts, there's lots of marginal names. Right, next type is prayer tags. Prayer tags, just one example. I've shown you this before. It says, "God help thee," on the wall of St Mary's Steeple, Bumpstead. And just picked out a few prayer tags. Well, they're ubiquitous in manuscript marginalia. A few examples from Humphrey Newton's manuscript there. Moral verses. So we have here a moral verse about young revellers at Ridgewell, a moral verse about not being too bold, not to be, too proud, too assertive. That comes from a poem called The ABC of Aristotle. We've just got the one verse here. Humphrey Newton, though, copies out the whole text, and he makes a note. This would be a very good set of verses to display in the hall, he says, on the frieze in the hall. So, again, a connection there, display of moral verses, and we see the same text being actually displayed in a church. Just going to say something very quickly about script. We're going back to the name Framlingham here. I apologise, I tried to pick out some of the features with a wobbly hand. Just to show you the characteristics. So the script is known as secretary. So the letter A, minuscule A, is formed from one compartment, like we have in the modern italic font. The letter G is formed with a flat top. A sort of like a letter U with a line across the top, and then a descender. So this script style is very, very common in medieval manuscripts, but it's clearly also being employed by the author of this graffito. The actual example here is highly calligraphic. You can see the fancy serifs, the very elaborate descenders and ascenders, and I've just given you some examples there from Humphrey Newton's manuscript, where he's doing a similar thing with those words cliff, castle, claim, and so on. And you can see another example of is his secretary hand on the right. So I think it's arguable that the graffiti text inscriptions adapt script styles that are used in manuscripts. I think that, I suggest that the adaptations meet the problems of writing vertically and on a hard surface. That would be hard. It's much harder than writing flat or on a sloping desk. Digital close-ups of graffiti text sometimes give us the impression that the script is large, but actually, in my experience, the graffito script is very, very small, and you have to really hunt to find these inscriptions, surprisingly small. I don't know if I don't think I gave you a ruler in any of those, but anyway, then really those letters are not much bigger than you would find in a manuscript. Going on to decorative devices associated with graffiti, again, one finds them replicated also in the manuscript. So here there's that nice little quatrefoil, barbed quatrefoil under the name Framlingham, and we get the same figure in Rate's manuscript. We get a similar kind of linear decoration also in Great Bardfield, and we get that again in Rate's manuscript. Just a word now about figurative devices and so on. Here we have some heraldic devices from Newton's manuscript, and also Rate got a shield. I think his fish, which are all over the place, are actually heraldic. And also that little thing, which I think is supposed to be a shell, a river. I think it's supposed to be a whelk shell, and I think it's a pun on the name Wilk, or Wilkes. So we find both Rate and Newton, and obviously countless other medieval people are interested in heraldic imagery. I showed you earlier that very fine dandy gentleman with his hat and his beard and so on. Newton is drawing these dandies all the time. We see here some male and female fashions in his manuscript, and he's working out how to do braided hair using a linear device, which is very like some of that decorative inscription that we saw earlier in the graffiti. Right, how am I doing? Right, I'm on time. Good. Conclusions. So conclusions, marginalia and graffiti. My examples suggest that it's not true that graffiti text does not use the conventions of other written and graphic language. It does. It uses the same conventions. Indeed, how could graffiti text not share those conventions? How could it not be part of that world? The grammar of visual communication is not limited to particular media. I've shown, I hope, that it is valid and important to apply linguistic, paleographical, and art historical methods of analysis. And I think this is happening too rarely in the work on the graffiti of medieval British parish churches. Many of the comparisons I've been making, of course, between graffiti and writing and imagery in books aren't limited to the margins. You could compare the main text as well with a lot of what we find in the graffiti. But there are two key characteristics, I think, that are shared by inscriptions in page margins and in graffiti. First, they share typical types of text. Short prayers, moral texts, and names were the entry point to writing. Only professionals or seriously committed amateur scribes would embark on writing out a long text, but names, moral verses, and short prayers were the copy texts used for elementary literacy training. They could be written from memory and were readily to hand in the mind for anyone with an elementary training in writing. Other factors at play appear to be imitation and repetition, and we've heard a bit about this earlier. Imitation is a characteristic of inscriptions found in page margins and graffiti. At Lydgate, for example, there are several images of windmills. Some are quite good, some are pretty crude. People have just copied. I could do one of those, and that's how it goes. And that's how people learn to write and draw. Names, again, appear alongside each other. I don't think it's just about dialogue. I think it's about writing practice, being a writer, really identifying as a writer. The idea that inscribing church pillars was a place where the lower classes could express themselves outside of the institutions of the church, in which I include education, is questionable. Graffiti inscribers and those who inscribed on manuscript pages were members of graphic communities with shared training and visual vocabularies. Another commonality between pillar and page margin is that both are improvised writing services. They're not prepared with ruling to receive writing. They've been used opportunistically. Although it's often been selected that the surfaces in churches that receive graffiti held some special significance for the scribes, near the door, near the chancel, and so on, from my researches, I would tentatively suggest that opportunity was important. Most of the inscriptions I have seen are between chest and hip height of a standing adult. Simply, graffiti inscribers used the sites that were available to be reached and inscribed with reasonable comfort. And similarly, those who write and draw in margins use a surface that's to hand. Sometimes they even write upside down or along a vertical margin. It's just they need the space to write. On the basis of these commonalities between pillar and page, I would argue that the resemblances between the two media are not superficial, as Matthew Champion suggests. The authors of both kinds of inscription share in the wider graphic culture of their communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Skeys. And now we go on with Laura Pani, a good friend of mine, but first of all, Professor for Latin Paleography at the University of Udine. Laura, up to you.
Thank you, Nicoletta, and I would like to thank Carlo and all his team for bringing us together in this conference. So, and I saw the dead, great and small, standing in the presence of the throne, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which was the book of life. And the dead were judged by those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the pool of fire. According to certain passages in the book of Revelation, the book of life, Liber Vitae, is the book that records the names of the dead and the works they did while still alive. Being registered in the Liber Vitae averts eternal damnation. In the early Middle Ages, the Libri Vitae, also known as Libri Memoriales, were the books owned and used by an ecclesiastical community to record the names of the people, either dead or alive, who were in some way related to it. By setting up and keeping a Liber Vitae, a religious institution fulfilled several purposes. First, it nourished the hope of believers of finding through prayers a place in the actual book of life that God will open on the day of judgment. Secondly, it responded to the ecclesiastical laws prescribing the commemoration of the living and the dead during the canon of the Mass. And finally, it provided a book that recorded the names of all those who were to be remembered. Not only was a book an essential support of memory, especially when the number of names became too many to remember by heart, but also constituted at the same time the ideal medium for additions and preservation. Basically, the Libri Vitae were liturgical books. They were placed on altars so as to be immediately available during celebrations, even if all names were not necessarily read out. The mere recording of names in a book in a place of high symbolic value, such as an altar, was enough to ensure the community's memory and prayers. In 1890, Adalbert Ebner distinguished between regular and irregular libri vitae. The former were conceived as libri vitae from the beginning. The latter were liturgical books of a different nature, mainly sacramentaries, that served for this purpose eventually. Today, only 8 regular libri vitae survive, dating from the end of the 8th to the end of the 9th century, but which were still used in subsequent centuries. Among them, for example, the Libri Memoriales of Reichenau and Remiremont. Ebner, for his part, listed a few irregular ones, dating from the 9th to the 11th century. 2 of the most famous are the Sacramentary from Notre Dame of Paris, now Vatican Ottoboni, late in 313, and the one of Essen, now in the University Library of Düsseldorf. Even more than the regular ones, these irregular libri vitae combined symbolic value of the sacred liturgical book with combined symbolic value, that of the sacred liturgical book, which recorded names in the margins, with practical use, as they offered immediate evidence of the names of the people to whom prayers should be addressed. The relationship between libri vitae and graffiti has already been emphasized several times elsewhere, recently also by Daniele Ferraiuolo for an Italian case, a southern Italian case. In particular, among the very numerous occurrences of graffiti with names found in sacred places or pilgrimage destinations, it has been shown how the names written on altars, presbytery walls, or liturgical furnishings may itself have constituted an alternative form, though not necessarily earlier, of liber vitae, in which the names to be remembered were simply written on a different medium, the surfaces of the church or its parts, rather than the pages or the margins of a book, generally with different techniques, that is, scratching rather than writing in pen and ink, but with the same intent and in the same manner, mostly in groups and mostly consistent, corresponding to families or religious or feudal communities in some way related to the religious community in charge of the place. More than the occasional emergence of names on the top, the edge, or the sides of altars, possibly the tip of the iceberg of a widespread practice of which little has survived, the altar slab of Reichenau Niedersell represents the most significant, best preserved, and therefore most widely investigable example of a liber vitae that is not a book, with names written in groups, either engraved, scratched, or written in pen, in a non-predetermined order over the course of at least 2 centuries. In this paper, I aim to investigate a different and somewhat opposite situation, that of libri vitae, which may have also served as a different but complementary medium simply to record the presence of certain people in a certain place, doing in this sense the function of so-called memorial or devotional graffiti. For that, I will specifically focus on the famous Codex Foro-Iuliensis, a gospel book now kept in Cividale del Friuli that was used as an irregular liber vitae in the 9th century. It had been copied about mid-6th century in uncial script in an undetermined Italian center, possibly Ravenna, where it was still kept at the end of the 8th century, according to some place names mentioned in a note on the liberation of a servant written on folio 5 verso in a half-Carsi early medieval script. The most interesting phase in the history of this manuscript, at least for the purposes of this conference, started in the second third of the 9th century and continued to the beginning of the 10th. At that time, the manuscript was kept in San Canzian di Sonzo, just a few kilometers from Aquileia, in the care of a community of secular clergy who guarded the relics of the saints Cantius, Cantianus, and Cantianilla, whose cult was widespread in a large part of Eastern and Northern Europe. It was at this stage that the manuscript was used to record the names, that is, as a liber vitae. In fact, its margins and the spaces between the columns are full with about 1,600 names of identified or still unidentified people, more concentrated in the first folios, but in fact recorded throughout the manuscript. Whereas some were presumably the very clergymen in charge of guarding the relics and keeping the book, most of them were pilgrims who stopped near Aquileia on their way from northern and eastern Europe to Rome, or were headed to San Canzian di Sonzo on purpose. The names of many high-profile personalities of Carolingian and non-Carolingian Europe have earned the manuscript the name of the Princess Gospel Book. It contains mainly Germanic, Slavic, and Latin names. They are usually recorded in groups from 2 or 3 up to more than 40 people. Within these groups, family connections are often expressed. I'm showing here the famous case of the Bulgarian king Boris Michael and his ambassador Sondoki, both recorded with their siblings and/or parents, wives, and children. In several cases, the names are accompanied by an ecclesiastical title, subdeacon, deacon, priest, but other titles are also found. Among them, and for sure 2 of the highlights of this manuscript, Lodoicus Imperator Ingelberga Regina, that is Louis II and his wife Ingilberga, and Domno Carolo Imperatore, Domno Liutuardo Episcopo, that is Charles IV, and his Chancellor Liutuard, the Bishop of Vercelli. Usually, the groups of names are recorded without introductory formulas. An exception is Memento Domine Famulorum, Famularumque Tuarum, Lord, remember your servants, for the large group of Witagovo, the Count of Carantania, a territory between Austria and Slovenia, and Domino Miserere Famulo tuo Ratepot et Famule tue Emeldrud, love, have mercy on your servant Ratpot and your servant Emeldrud, for an unidentified Ratpot and presumably his wife. Some more notes are introduced by this same formula, Domine Miserere Famulo tuo, followed by the names of the clergymen alone, alone or in small groups. According to Uwe Ludwig, who studied and edited all the legible names in this Liber Vitae, the latter type of notes concern the clergymen of the community that kept the book, which is suggested by the same type of invocation at the beginning, the always explicit ecclesiastical titles, and the presence of Roman Lombard names, often recurring in different groups. In only one case is the provenance of the registered people made explicit, the above-mentioned Bulgarian king Boris Michael and his ambassador Sondoki. There are only a few obituary notes on folios 6 recto and verso. They are also the only ones in which a date is made explicit, even if limited to the day and month, as usual in the Libri Vitae and in the early medieval graffiti. To summarize, between the second third of the 9th and the beginning of the 10th century, according to prosopographical studies that identified the people recorded, none of whom can be traced before or after this time span, this old gospel book served as the Liber Vitae. Its pages were covered with the names of living and in a few cases dead people connected with the community that owned it, mainly pilgrims visiting the sanctuary that held the relics of the Kantiani saints, but also local clergymen. Some of the entries are limited to groups of names, others emphasize with the introductory formula, Lord, remember your servant, their commemorative function. In other terms, these names were written down to be remembered in the prayers of the religious community of San Canzian d'Isonzo. So far, so good then, and nothing different from the function of Libri Vitae in any event. But, there is always a but. A few years ago, I happened to make a paleographic study of the handwriting in the manuscript in order to answer a couple of simple questions. One, who wrote all these names? Was it the pilgrims themselves or the clergymen in charge of the book and who were praying for the people recorded? In other words, were all those writings autograph or allograph? And two, what kind of scripts are used for the recordings in these Liber Vitae? The first question had not been discussed before them. Sometimes these recordings had been defined subscriptions or signatures, thus implying their autography, but both a specific note on folio 215 verso and a more general paleographical analysis suggest a different answer. In the note on folio 215 verso, the record of a small group of people, including a certain adoloc, contains the statement, iste adoloc, ista nomina scribere rogavit. This adoloc had these names written, which prove an allography, at least for this intervention. But the same hand that recorded this adoloc's group is found in several other groups of names, written in non-sequential folios of the manuscript, as is proven by the morphological analysis of the script. Let's observe, for example, the ascender of D going down the baseline, the small hook at the beginning of E, the shape of the letter G, the drop-shaped O, the presence of cursive ligatures with R. The same hand was responsible for the formula Inicium Evangelii Secundum Ioannem, added in mixed capital and minuscule letters at the beginning of John's Gospel, the hand's identity being again proven by the shape of letters like A, E, capital M, and S. And this is an addition that only a reader of the book, not a pilgrim, could be allowed to write in the book. We might even be tempted to name the scribe. It was perhaps the Deacon Secundus, as this note on folio 12 verso, of course by the same hand, suggests. One more example, the names of Louis II and his wife are written by the same hand in a number of records of still unidentified groups of people, and of an addition, Shishitabatur, between the lines of the text of Matthew's Gospel. The identity of hand is proven, among other features, by the 45 degrees inclined back of A, the extended tongue of E, the shape of G, the long arch of R. If we assume that only a member of the community could intervene in correcting the text, we must deduce that he was also in charge of recording all these groups. The examples could continue. In general terms, when different groups of identified people are recorded by the same hand, and these groups are not related to each other, it seems quite clear that that hand did not belong to any of the people forming the group, but to the clergyman in charge of the book, and all the more so if that hand is responsible for interventions of a different nature. On the contrary, the orthography cannot be excluded in at least two cases. One, here, when different hands are present in the same group of people, as in this case on folio 4 verso, where the name of the Moravian prince Sventibald, Sventipulk, is written by an unsteady hand, different from the one who wrote the names of his wife, Sventezizna, and of a certain Predeslav. And two, moreover, in the case of some isolated names, as in the examples shown here, to which I will return in a moment. As for the scripts, I have identified 3 different types of writing, managed at different levels of graphic competence. There are just a few cases of capital script, and in all of them, the capital letters from both the epigraphic and uncial alphabet are mixed with minuscule ones. The Caroline minuscule is by far the most represented script. In general terms, it is a fully canonized Caroline minuscule, as it might actually be expected some decades after the birth and formation of this script, with just a few and rare reminiscences of the pre-Caroline scripts, as some cursive ligatures or the cursive form of letter A. In some cases, it suggests the work of unsteady or unskilled hands. There are several records in early medieval half-cursive script. In most cases, it is unskilled hands tracing letters of the new Roman cursive alphabet, but with an unsteady ductus and without any ligatures, as in some of the cases shown here. According to Armando Petrucci, this was the pattern of the so-called basic elementary writing taught and learned at the first steps of the graphic education before the Caroline minuscule took over and became established. Perhaps not by chance, the presence of such types of writings is mostly observed for single names rather than in groups, that is, for those records that might presumably be autographed. So I come to the main question of this paper. Why were all these names written? What was the function of these recordings? Although the main purpose of recording names in a Liber Vitae was to secure the prayers of the community who kept the book, in the case of the Codex Foro Iuliensis, I would not exclude the possibility of a similarity with the so-called memorial or devotional graffiti, that is, the names scratched on the walls of sacred places and pilgrimage destinations, simply to declare and record the presence of certain people in a certain place. The plausible orthography of at least some names can, in my opinion, prove this assertion true. In other terms, while some people explicitly ask to be recorded in the book, together with their companions and family, and probably paid for that in exchange for prayers, someone might have simply written their name to say, I was here. Incidentally, whilst all the names are written in pen and ink, there is one exception, that of folios 178 verso 79 recto, where a group of names is scratched on the parchment, plausibly by the same hand that also wrote them in pen. To conclude, whilst the relationship between graffiti and Libri Vitae is well known for the Middle Ages, this paper aimed to investigate a relationship in the opposite direction, that of a book used to record names with a commemorative function, but which might have also served as a different medium from the walls or the liturgical furnishing of a church, simply to record the presence of someone in a sacred place. In this sense, different from the several well-known sacramentaries used as irregular Libri Vitae in normal religious institutions, the Cividale Gospel Book was kept in a famous pilgrimage destination and presumably shown more often to the pilgrims than used for the liturgy. The presence of isolated names written by unskilled hands, not found anywhere else in the manuscript, suggests both an autography and a slightly different function for at least some of them, not necessarily a recording in exchange for prayers, but simply a memorial record of the presence of some people in a sacred place, not scratched on the walls, but written on the pages of a book. Thank you.
Last but not least, we have Elisa Pallottini, member of the Chieti Pescara Graff-IT, group, the main unit of the ERC of Cavo Tedeschi. And okay, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. So this paper draws from the surveys carried out by the team of the Graff-IT Project for the building of an Italian corpus of medieval and early modern graffiti. So these researches have brought to my attention a written artifact from central Italy, which finds no parallel within the written documentation from Italy, and is also almost unknown to scholars. It is an 11th century or early 12th century reliquary from Monte Cosaro, a small town in the Marche region, on which more than 100 names of individuals, of both men and women, ecclesiastic and not, were written down by different hands at different times before the relic container was deposited into the altar. This reliquary belongs to the group of the so-called Lipsanothek, which were made to carry and transport the relics and contain the relics, which were used in the ceremony of the church consecration, and which are attested in larger numbers in other contexts of Western Europe, within a time frame that goes from the 10th up to the 12th century. So it is in relation to this chronological context and the material context of this type of objects that the nominal graffiti that I have mentioned in the title will be discussed. So to begin with, it is important to point out that written reliquaries of all kinds are widely attested in Italy as elsewhere in both Western and Eastern Europe from the early Christian period and throughout the Middle Ages, and of course beyond. It doesn't, yeah. Among the oldest surviving examples of relic containers made to be deposited inside the altars of churches during the consecration ritual is a silver capsa, which was also shown in the previous relation, found beneath the altar of the Church of Santi Eufemia Grado. It bears are circular inscriptions recording the names of both the earthly and the heavenly patrons of the reliquary, besides an elaborated decoration which displays the image of Christ and of the saints whose relic the box contained. The capsa, first of all, reminds us of the fact that the association of the faithful's name with the altars of consecrated church buildings has a long and complex tradition in the history of Christianity. One that involved the use of several material bearers of names, such as the reliquaries, but also ivory diptychs, liturgical books, and of course, the altars themselves. Secondly, the box from Grado can also be taken as an example to show one of the ways in which formal inscriptions could differ from more spontaneous, so to say, writings, which we often qualify as graffiti. In fact, while the silver reliquary and this inscription are the result of the same designing and manufacturing program, in the Lipsanoteca from Monte Cosaro, on the right-hand side, they are not. And this is clear from the use in the latter of different writing techniques, from the number and formal variety of scripts that were made by different hands, and from their overall chaotic placement of names on almost all surfaces of the reliquary, except under it, mostly at spots that were clearly not intended for writing. This paper does not attempt to discuss graffiti through the lens of an umbrella definition, which may or may not be considered as generally valid. Rather, it focuses on the evidence of the writings themselves, beyond any terminology and any categorization, using the reliquary for Monte Cosaro as the main case study to bring into discussion a type of material which has traditionally occupied only a marginal position within the field of written culture studies. What also makes the Lipsanoteca from Monte Cosaro an interesting example in the context of this discussion is that, as I have already said, that this object is an isolated example within the written documentation from the Italian peninsula, at least as far as I know. So if you know other examples, please let me know. More evidence of this practice is found in southwestern France and the northeast of the Iberic Peninsula. The bulk of evidence comes from Catalonia, where many Lipsanothecae have been discovered during archaeological excavation in pre-Romanesque and Romanesque church buildings. So on the slide, you can see only a few examples that date from the 10th up to the 12th century, which is also the period when the practice of scratching names on the altar slabs is widely attested, especially, but I would say not exclusively, in the same geographical context. These Lipsanothecae have formed the subject of quite a number of studies in both Spanish and French historiography. They have mostly been discussed in both their textual and liturgical dimension. But I argue that examination of the material features of the writings that could be written down on them may give us useful insights into the key concepts of margin and graffiti that this conference aims at further exploring. The Lipsanoteca from the Church of Santa Maria in Piedi Chienti, that is the name of the church, is a modest rectangular box of arenite stone, only 9 centimeters high, covered with a flat lid, which has no decoration. It was found inside the altar of the church during renovation works carried out in the 1920s by the Superintendenza ai Monumenti delle Marche. At the time of the discovery, their reliquary still held 4 small boxes, one of which still with some relics inside, and bore traces of the red wax used to seal the repository. As pointed out by Giuseppe Avarucci, who gave the first and still the only existing edition of the text, the reliquary is an important testimony of the event of the consecration of the church. Unfortunately, however, the general scarcity of documentation on the church, as well as the finding of the reliquary out of the context of its original placement, impede a precise dating of the artifact and thus the consecration to which the written object relates. It is also difficult to propose an exact date, or perhaps better dates, for the making of the writings, as is often the case with the Lipsanothecae, the written Lipsanothecae of the period. From 2 inscriptions, still preserved inside the church, we know that the church was integrally rebuilt on initiative of Agenolfus, abbot of Farfa from 1125, and that in the same year, probably, the church was consecrated newly. The paleographical evidence does not contrast with such chronology, although an 11th century date seems very plausible too. So despite these difficulties, we can still be sure that the names were written by different hands at different times, perhaps on occasions of 2 different consecrations, and date to between the 11th and the first quarter of the 12th century. After this period, the practice of writing one's name down onto the Lipsanothecae, as well as an altar slab, become increasingly more sporadic. There are, in total, about 110 occurrences of names of men and women, both clergymen, namely priests, monks and nuns, and laymen, if we consider the absence of ecclesiastical titles as a proof of the individual's secular status. In a few instances, however, the secular title Dominus and the female correspondent one to Domina are mentioned. From the point of view of materiality, which is the aspect that interests us the most today, such an omastic corpus does not form a coherent group of items. As you can see, names are often presented as a group, but in other cases, they are scattered on the object without any sense of order, in different directions, written by different hands in different kinds of scripts. Some names are scratched with a hard tip or are incised more deeply in rustic capital or minuscule letters, or a combination of the two, which often do not follow a straight ductus and are executed without much care. Some other names instead were made by chisel. I hope I pronounced the name correctly, chisel, a chisel, thank you, in a more formal type of script. Such is the case of the text that occupy the most visible spots of the reliquary, the top of the lid and the front. The one on the lid has letters swathed with plaster, but it is uncertain, at least to me, whether this was part of the original technique or decoration. The script is executed with richly ornamented minuscule letters, which overlap with one another at the end of line 1 and 3, perhaps to keep the names grouped together in just one line. They were certainly written by a trained hand. Someone who was familiar with the type of epigraphic script usually referred to as Romanesque. And according to me, this description might date well to the 11th century, perhaps second half of the 11th century. So the same or similar execution technique was used for the writing of the first two names of the list that is written on the frontal panel of the box, right below the upper margin. They are made by chisel in capital letters, perhaps by the hand of the same person who also worked on the lid. Not sure though. For their graphic and technical features, these two texts look closer to formal inscriptions than they do to extemporaneous writings, as graffiti are also often defined. The same observation also applies to two lists of names that are written, certainly by the same hand, on the verso of the lid, right here, and on one short side of the box. There were thus several hands at work in this reliquary, and it's generally difficult to make a distinction among all of them. But well, I'm working on it. A question can still be posed, one that is concerned with the relationship between the script and the support, which is so important, as I have said before. We often rely on the notion of graffiti as informal writings placed on pre-existing objects and thus on spots where they were not supposed to be. But was it always the case? Can we always be sure? Or does this aspect need to be explored further than just that? So as to the question whether it was always the case, if we take a broader look at the written evidence, the answer to this question must be no, perhaps. In fact, it is not uncommon to find on the Lipsanotheque the written records of those who contributed to the manufacturing of the objects, among whom were commissioners, donors, and artists, which are kinds of texts that invite us to further reflect on the notion of spontaneity and premeditation of the act of writing. From the evidence of Lipsanotheque, it appears that the reproducer of the writing was sometimes also the one responsible for the making of the object. Take the example of the Stucco Lipsanoteca from Santa Coloma de Cabanelles, which contains a text that is roughly incised in an irregular majuscule script, which does not follow a ductus and seems to adapt to the available space without any preparation of the surface prior to the making of the writing. This choice, the choice to place the text there, is significant to my view because the text records the makers of the reliquary, both the commissioner and the artisan. So Stephanus' order and the priest Senifredus executed. The lid of the Lipsanoteca from the Church of Santa Maria de Lledó in the same region, so in Catalonia and actually very close to Cabanelles, presents the exact same type of text written in the exact same writing with the same linguistic variation, which are also found on the other box. So use it for use it. One can therefore conclude that the priest Senifredo is the maker of the reliquary and the celebrative texts in both cases. The box on the right-hand side also contains a list of names scratched with a dry point, a hard tip, in unusual cursive script, with all the names written by the same hand without any graphic distinction between them. However, the question as to who wrote these names remains in this case, well, unanswered. In another case, instead, a Lipsanoteca from southwestern France, we can hypothesize that the long list of names that appears on one side of the box was written by one of the main contributors to the reliquary, the priest Gaucelmus. His name is mentioned 3 times in the list, twice in the middle of the text, along with the names of other benefactors, and one at the very end of the list, with letters that are twice or even 3 times bigger than the rest, and were perhaps a sign of special status. That's a question. The identification of this priest as one of the makers of the reliquary, as well as the only producer of the writing, is supported by the paleographical analysis of script, as well as by the evidence of a second text that is placed on the lid of the box, right below the upper margin, reading Gaucelmus me fecit. So while it was already a privilege for the faithful to write down or have his name write down on the very container used to hold the relics, it seems clear that a few ones named held a special position. The wooden lid on the Lipsanoteca from Villa Torta offers a case in point in this respect, and I think in general much food for thought. It presents many names that were inked, engraved, or scratched, or also a combination of these 3 techniques by different hands, but all on the same occasion of the church consecration in 1050. A few of these individuals named seems to have been especially honored by the Leiavo script. They are the same individuals who are also mentioned as the petitioners of the church consecration in a recommendation parchment that was found inside the wooden container. Turning back to the names on the Lipsanoteca from Montecosaro, the role played by all the individuals recorded in the writings remain unclear. Some of them may be identified with the sponsors of the founding of the church, of its liturgical furnishing, for example, or with the reliquary's maker, why not, who gave very special contribution to the event of the church consecration by making the reliquary. All of these, but I would also say many other options, are open. So in addition to the technical and graphic feature of script, another crucial aspect to consider is where the names were located within the space of the reliquary. So what then does the placement of names tell us about the possible meanings that could lay behind the action of writing them down at specific spots? Names, for example, can be placed in liminal position, such as close to the borders of the box and the lid as well, or on the margins, understood here in a broad sense, of a written space. Such is the case with the name of Ildericus and Carbone, which were written by different hands next to and in the space between the lines of a pre-existing list of names. Note also that the name of Carbone, which you can see between the line 1, 2, appears other 3 times in the space of the reliquary, written by the same hand, both on the outside and on the inside of the container, whether in the context of an organic list of names or singularly, as is found on the interior of the box. This was perhaps the most marginal space in terms of accessibility for the writing of names, but was at the same time also the most privileged one, due, of course, to the close vicinity of the name with the relics of saints. Several other names were written down in this space, probably by the end of the same individual's named. I actually kept the box in the the right position, so I did not move the picture upside down. So many other names were written indeed inside, all by different hands, and probably the hand of the same individual named. The physical action of writing them could then be seen as another way, perhaps for the faithful name, to establish and express spiritual vicinity with specific nominal communities, as well as a connection with the sacred dimension. In the context of these and other Lipsanotheker, to conclude, the word margin may acquire supplementary meanings. It can be understood as a place of encounter that bears witness to the interaction of the individual with the specific object, whereby the physical action of writing was also carried out by the handling and the rotating of the object, as the different direction of the scripts suggest, not this one, but others. Beyond the perspective of materiality, the term marginality can also be understood as a space that bridged communication across the earthly and the heavenly dimension, but across people too. Through the physical action of writing their own names, the faithful could leave something on themselves in that very sacred space, benefiting from the physical proximity with the relics of the saints. I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa. Grazie, Elisa, for your so beautiful work. And I'm very happy because we have a lot of time for the general discussion. So let's start with remarks and questions. And the first one from
me. It's not so much a comment as perhaps a gathering of some thoughts that might lancer la discussion. What struck me today is 2 things to start with. One is, if we were to even simplify things, it's quite remarkable how many comments we've heard today just dealing with names. If we take something as simple as a name, which can be just one word or 2 words, maybe, or 3 if there's a title, and the many meanings, right? The many functions. So it's I think that in itself is really a good indication of how complex and rich the graffiti phenomenon is. So that's my first comment. And then, if you guys want to comment upon that, that would be wonderful. The other thing that struck me, thinking back to the whole papers we heard today, is how many of you talked about related practices. Now, I'll mention a few that occurred to me, and that's why it could be kind of the occasion for answers from you. But I think that shows, and then I'll give you the examples, how graffiti is not a marginal practice, but that it's inserted into a whole galaxy of practices which involve different technologies, different objects, right? Different sites, you'll see. And therefore, it's a continuum. And that is why, perhaps going to, I think it was Hachik who was talking about you made me worry at one point because you were really talking about the distinction between graffiti and inscription. And I realized that when I talk about graffiti, because I have, this French training that has made me absolutely detest repetitions. I don't bear saying the same word, right, Estelle, you agree, you know what I'm talking about. I absolutely torture my students if they repeat a word too many times. So I keep using inscription as an alternative to graffiti. But here's the thing, so it really, you made me think about it. And then I started wondering if when you were discussing that, it's because we established a hierarchy. Right? An inscription is more formalized, blah, blah, blah. But if then we are starting to think about graffiti within this continuum of practices, then maybe that hierarchy melts because there could be some graffiti that are more formalized and some that are less. You see me going. So now a few examples that occurred to me. When Estelle and Clément were talking, I thought about signet rings. When you mark your coat of arms into something, and you're marking it with a matrix, and you're making, right? So then I thought about Hachik's mention of the Matesi, right, as a title? Matesi, as a title, that you get to wear after you've been in a pilgrimage. And I kind of, did that to Carlo and said, it's like pilgrimage badges that you get to wear on you. And by the way, let's not forget that people would also literally wear prints. Again, I think connected with some of the material, right? And that's why there's so few early woodcuts, because of the extensive, intensive use, right? Worn, sewn into clothes, pasted into traveling cases, etc., etc. Then, Wendy, when you were talking, were you there? When you were talking about other forms of text. So, of course, margin. And by the way, I'm so glad you kind of bashed about it a little bit, our friend. No, Matthew's adorable, but he's not really a scholar. And nobody tell him that, please. The guy is wonderful, but he's not a scholar. And what occurred to me is confusing two types of marginalia. There's the actual inscriptions, right? The comments, what we still do in books. And then there's what manuscript scholars call marginalia, which are this highly problematic set of decorations that, okay. But you talked about, texts in homes, for instance. We again, us French educated people, can think about the text in Montaigne's Tower. And that too then means, you might not be painting the text on your beams. You commission something to do that. How different is it from, and today we heard about, right, going to a place and having someone actually make the graffito for you. So that too, again, exists in a continuum. And finally, then I'll stop, but Elisa, when you were talking about that Lipsanoteca with those inscriptions, the desire to place your name on a relic container made me think about a series of things. First of all, unfortunately, since Vatican II, you don't need to put a relic in an altar anymore, but an altar would basically look like a stone box. On that stone box, you have a text, right? So it makes you think about the relationship between relic containers and inscription. And of course, then you would have collections of relics with inscriptions identifying the relics. And then also the very idea of placing your name on top of a box that contains a relic made me think about the practice of kissing relics and kissing containers and all that, which is, it's a physical way of interacting, right? So anyway, those are my thoughts. So you guys can.
Comes first. Right. Thank you very much. About these two terms, graffiti and inscription, honestly, we don't use in Armenian these terms. We say for everything written or inchised or engraved text, we call vimagir. which means inscription sampling. So I use the graffiti, or my colleagues use the graffiti in such kind of conferences to be sure that yes, everybody understand. We don't use. That's why I stopped and I asked whether it's inscription or graffito for that case. Of course, we have this. We try to be more precise and call formula regular things or text on the stone, on wood, doesn't matter, to inscription. But these things which are unskillfully incised or engraved, we call graffiti to distinguish both of types. So we don't use graffiti in Armenian as a separate word to indicate these kind of writings. And to comment the second is for the term mahtesi. It's not only for the inscriptions, but also for whoever, let's say, whoever visited the Holy Land, took this term, took this word, which derives, however, from Arabic muhtusi, which always means the same. So a person who visited the Holy Land, which is equivalent of Turkic haji, as I mentioned. So for the Armenian case, the Armenians, by visiting the Holy Land, they took not only this term mahtesi, but also they made a tattoo cross in so, and until at this very moment, even this practice is exists. So whoever wants to have this special sign, this is a small cross with a specific type, so which indicate that he or she visited the yes, usually in this part. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Perhaps I should just enlarge on my thoughts about Matthew Champion. So, it's been very inspiring because he's inspired a whole lot of teams of citizen scientists to go out there and record material. Unfortunately, it's much easier if you're a citizen scientist to pick out a geometric figure. There's a, or that there's another witch mark, there's another geometric. And so that's basically what they have surveyed. And the text, sadly, has been left. And I think particularly the things that we can conferences where I've really felt that the citizen scientists and the archaeologists as well would actually benefit from a more interdisciplinary approach, where those of us, I'm not a graffitologist, but I'm pleased to learn this word, but those of us who deal in text in books could have something to contribute to the study of graffiti and kind of right the balance. So I didn't want to bash it, but at the same time, which is,
I was joking. But if I can say just one thing about, I mean, Carlo and I were on a panel and I invited Matthew Champion to be with us. So, I mean, he's a lovely guy. I think his biggest contribution really has to do with the surveys and with the fact that so many people go around the countryside recording those graffiti, and those will ensure that they will be safe. I mean, that's why I thought he was important for that panel, which was on the raising the status of graffiti as a heritage. I mean, it was a conference on heritage and the medieval, you know, and medieval culture. So I think that's his contribution. What I wanted to ask you, by the way, speaking on the topic of champion, what tells us that those geometric forms are apotropaic?
That's what I was saying. There are different categories, aren't there? And how do we really know? But that's his view. Yes, and they are found in places like doorways and so on, where you might, I guess, want to keep witches out or whatever. I don't know. But just a little aside. When I visited Lydgate Church in Suffolk, this became quite famous, I think, because Matthew Champion had been there and he'd read an inscription which he read to say John Lydgate is a late medieval English poet, and he read it to say John Lydgate wrote this with license or something. And I didn't realize that there was a local person who came to show me around, and he was a scholar and he'd been a parish priest, not there. Anyway, and he showed me this with great pride. And I said, well, I can't see it could possibly say John Lydgate. And anyway, you wouldn't call yourself John Lydgate in Lydgate because all the Johns would be John Lydgate. So, and it was only after that he took me outside and showed me this beautiful heritage information plaque that it had made, which enshrined this finding that John Lydgate had written this in the church, and it's all there. Anyway, I did say to this guy who showed me around, don't worry, I won't tell anyone, but I've just told you all. So, but that's one of the problems, I think, particularly with the text, that it's jolly difficult to read. And if you haven't got training in reading medieval languages, you don't stand a chance. So but it's been awfully useful for me. It was awfully useful to be able to use the databases and, you know, to look at some of the material, even though I did go back and visit everything myself. Thank you.
Actually, I have a question for Elisa, if I may. Yeah. Because it's really a fascinating example, this Lipsanothek, because normally we think that the relics are put in the box during the consecration of the church, of the chapel, and then it's finished. But normally, but we see that there is a movement. There are movements. So and it at different periods, and we can imagine that it's done during ceremony because it's the altar. So do you have, I don't know, some archive about it, some charters or, you know, some texts that describe this, or nothing at all? Yes, or example or something close to this.
Well, thanks for asking me this, because there was a part of the paper that I had to cut off. It was way too much. And it was actually related with the fact that the practice of including names in the altar. Oh, sorry, the practice of including naming inside the altars, it was, well, of course, not codified in normative text. So apparently there are no references to this to the act of writing, to the graffiti or inscription, whenever we want to call it. And I actually managed to write a paper without almost using none of these two terms, so I'm quite proud. So, but it was still part of the official discourse. So it is actually, this practice is mentioned in the Pontificale Narbonense from the 11th century, and refers to the recommendation parchment, consecration parchment, so not to the writings on the Lipsanotheke, but to other kinds of writing. In any case, there were references, although not directly to that type of writings. Anyway, what I found also interesting is that on that box, we also have, as we saw, names on at the bottoms on the interior panel. So which means that they had to be written down before the deposition of relics. So my guess, my interpretation, as far as I can tell so far, is that people did not really play a role maybe in the liturgical ritual itself, but contributed to it in the sense that I have explained. So they were related to liturgy in this sense, not that they were actually actors, of course. But this is also something that we cannot exclude because of the custom of, taking oaths on the altar, for instance, and that's completely, path I still need to explore. But yeah, I think.
Thank you. I just want to ask a question of everybody, actually. I think it was Veronique, you mentioned, I think it was you who mentioned the idea that graffiti were made with a stylus. Who mentioned that?
No, they did. Yes. No. Yeah, the connection with the stylus was Garucci.
Yeah.
Who explains specifically as he's justifying it, since after all, he's the first one really using the term and justifying it. I mean, the term as a substantive.
Yes.
He connects it with the Roman writing with a stylus, metal or bone on the wax tablet.
So my question about this, when I was doing part of a chapter on graffiti, I wondered, all these churches, I wondered what implement was being used. It's quite soft, and it's obviously a form of defamational writing. And because I was interested in the links between some graffiti text and basically text you copied out when you were learning to write, I wondered, wouldn't it be great if they were actually doing it with a stylus? And churches were often the venue for parish schools and so on. So I contacted some museums who have collections of styli and said, do you think they possibly could have used these? And actually, sadly, they said no. So I just wondered if there is any evidence, because I was thinking this would.
Here's some thoughts, Wendy, and I don't know if that's going to answer your question. First, I mean, often people say it could be a nail, could be anything sharp. The other thing is, yes, I agree, probably. I mean, first of all, when would you be using a stylus?
The schools met.
And they use
parish church, and they had wax tablets.
And they would be using wax tablets.
Styling, and it's.
But you know, okay, so if indeed, I mean, you're teaching me something there. If indeed they were still using styli during the Middle Ages, well, in a way, this is a case where, no, you wouldn't use that on a wall. I mean, this is a little bit like my mom, who would absolutely forbid me to use her scissors for sewing, for cutting fabric, to use it on paper, because it, Clément shakes his, you've been through, right? But wait, no, I'm not finished. So it's if you're scratching on a wall, you're not using an actual good tool. I think that's number one. But what I want to also throw in, I mentioned it yesterday to the Dutch students, is this is not really technical, it's more metaphorical. When you think about how you prepare a manuscript, how you work on parchment, first of all, you actually scratch lines, and even the writing with a pen, you are scratching the parchment. So in a way, there's that idea of incising, but then yes, probably they wouldn't use good tools to be but you can find sharp instruments. I mean that, right?
Well, yes, of course, scissors, which were not like modern scissors, but that's another possibility.
The scissors things, what I meant is my mom wouldn't allow me scissors for fabric to be used on paper, because apparently cutting paper with good scissors, right?
Whereas medieval
blunts them.
They might have had a different thought
of a pointed instrument. Exactly. Adam wants to say.
Like to add something about the technique of execution of graffiti, not the medieval graffiti, neither from Nubia nor from Europe, but much older graffiti from Greek Roman Egypt. In the 90s and the beginning of this millennium, I worked on graffiti in the temple of Hatshepsut in Deir Bahari, that I published in a book that appeared in 2006. I collected some 300 inscriptions about graffiti and dipinti. The majority of them were graffiti. And it was my impression, which bordered with the full confidence, with the conviction that those graffiti in Greco-Roman Egypt, in the Greco-Roman temple, not Greco-Roman temple, but in the pharaonic temple in Greco-Roman times, were produced with silex, with stone. There are numerous silex pieces with stings. You see, stings, you can call it sting. Yeah, they have very, very, the points, and you easily scratch with them in a stone. But I have to add that the stone used for the Hatshepsut temple is very soft. It's
right.
limestone.
It's exactly what I was going to say. We have to think about the support. And having been to Egypt, and of course being interested in graffiti and keep looking at them in Egyptian temples, you can tell it's a very soft stone. So there's that. There's also the material. It's what are you dealing with. And again, it's something else to be writing on frescoes. It doesn't take much to scratch the intonaco, and it doesn't take much. And we've been talking about that. I mean, someone was talking about the support itself, right? How you have to be very opportunistic in choosing, where you're placing your graffito. If you have a red or dark background in fresco, it's not going to take much to scratch that very thin surface. I mean, the intonaco is very thin, and then you get white from the exactly. Or a needle, maybe a sharper, the kind of thick needle you might use for, say, leather. You can think about the whole range of implements available to you that can just scratch the surface. And for frescoes, you're really scratching the surface, and a very thin surface.
Sorry. Yeah, in pilgrim accounts, we have some evidences of tools used for graffiti. You have mentioned of daggers used for graffiti, and mention of poinçon. I don't know. Oh, okay. 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 Yes. Right. And no. Yeah, and there is a relation between the materials, the height, accessibility. For instance, on the facade of the Holy Sepulchre, graffiti carved in columns are at eye level and not higher. After 2, 3, 4 meters, there are only painted graffiti. So yes, there is a relation. Yes, and the pillars are marbles. And we know that for this kind of graffiti that you show, for example, we need a hammer and a chisel. And a very famous account, Jacques de Véronne, in the 1335, explains that when he arrived in Jerusalem, he ordered 2 iron chisels to take relics from the early places. So maybe there was a kind of selling tools to make graffiti or yes.
On the topic of tool, before I pass you the microphone, one surface we didn't talk about is glass.
I see.
And diamonds. I mean, that is documented, people writing names with their diamond. You're ready. Because you want, that's an interesting thing, on glass, right?
I just wanted to add that in
Tarquinia. I studied graffiti which were written inside an Etruscan tomb on the wall. And this wall was not made of plaster. It was made only with clay. I mean, the Etruscans just covered the wall with clay. So as the tomb is 4 or 5 meters underneath, the clay was tender, it was soft. And so the tool that medieval people used to write was just a piece of wood that they, a little stick. Not even pointy. I mean, you can even tell what kind of wood. It's no. They just used this typical plant that grows even now in Tarquinia and in Sardinia. It's called ferula, which is a kind of fennel. It grows like up to 2 meters high. And at one point during the year, it dries and it leaves these little sticks that are very rich in fibers. And that's why I can guess they used this kind of tool, because you can see that fibers are still visible in the,
Till now, speakers are speaking to each other, but we have, okay, but we have some more questions, please. Yeah, I go, and I have to stop you. Okay.
On the question of materiality, you mentioned glass and diamonds. I was interested to hear about pottery graffiti in Nubia, and it was, no?
The subject is that huge that I don't know how to answer your question. There are thousands of pottery graffiti. They were executed on complete pots. Just an attempt to classify them. There are generally 2 types of pottery graffiti. One type are signatures. There are personal names with titles. Sometimes there are several types because the owners of the pots were frequently persons of people of importance, so they multiply their titles. They were this and this and this and this and this. This might be a long inscription along around a pot. This is one type of inscriptions, and the other type, also extremely common, are I would say I think that the function of those other types of inscriptions is apotropaic. Imagine that the ancient and medieval people were very much concerned about being entered by demons. The demon cause every illness, and the demons enter people through different holes we have in our body, like our mouth. So the demons can enter you if you eat. So your plates should be protected against demons by putting holy names on the plate. So we frequently have plates, pots, jugs, bowls with names of Archangel Michael, who is a beloved figure of Christian Nubian piety. his name is written either in scriptio plena, so Michael, or is abbreviated, or is written as a monogram, or is written as a numerical cryptogram. These numerical cryptograms are a very characteristic element of Nubian literacy. The numerical cryptogram of Michael is 689. This is the sum of the numerical value of the letters of his name. So Mi is 40, Iota is 10, and so on, so on. It gives 688. So you can find 5 times 689 on your pot, or Michael written 5 times on the pot. So things like that. An extreme example is this monastery in Dongola. In one room, 2 service pots, table services were discovered belonging to the archimandrites of the monastery. Each table service contains some 15 or 20 different pots, plates, bowls, jugs, all of them inscribed with these inscriptions. So inscriptions with signatures giving the name and the titles, and apotropaika. Interestingly, all inscriptions containing inscriptions relating to the transportation. So, for example, on amphorae or other transport containers are painted. They are not graffiti in the technical sense, and the graffiti are like that: signatures and apotropai, holy names invoked as protectors.
And maybe to shortly follow up on that, shortly, part of the characteristics of graffiti that I read of is that it's on a surface not primarily designed for this purpose.
Yes,
and
yeah, I would define graffiti like that. Yes.
Can you say that this is not? Well, the primary purpose of it is to use it for food or something like that, to eat, to drink, to put things on. But can you also say it was not meant for it to be written on, this pottery? Or do you think it's
meant to be written? I think I think it was meant to be written by demons.
Yeah. So you write something back to...
Yeah, I think that the owner of the pot, Archbishop George or Archimandrite Lazarus, wrote, he himself or his secretary wrote the name of Michael 5 times. Just the demon who could have attacked Lazarus during eating reads this holy name and is so afraid that he keeps away.
Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm asking about a different type of communication. I would like to go back to the Armenian graffiti, because you said at the beginning that it's a great case study also to look at sort of multicultural communication and so on. Do you see that the Armenian graffiti actually sort of in some way communicate with the graffiti of other languages around? Because you would think as graffiti, they're sort of more centered on sort of the communication between the sort of worldly sphere and holy sphere. And maybe is there a difference between the graffiti and the inscriptions you see? Because I felt like the inscriptions were rather focused on a sort of communication to the community as well.
Thank you very much for the question. I think in the Holy Sepulchre, we have inscriptions in Arabic, Greek, Syriac, Latin, and Armenian, Georgian. So these inscriptions or graffiti were left by pilgrims who were there, and they hoped by this way connect their names to this holy site. Communication between these cultures, I mean, between the peoples who left this, can be interpreted in 2 ways. First of all, I mentioned one example when after a shipwreck, some people were died. So in that ship, we have some information in archives of the Patriarchate that, for example, a ship or ships, let's say, who were traveling to the Holy Land from, especially from Constantinople, may have on board 300, 200, and moreover pilgrims, which are Greek, Armenian, Syriac. So all these peoples were coming to Holy Land together in the late Middle Ages. So they know each other. So while they're visiting the Holy Land, but by leaving their names, in this case, I don't see that. I don't think that they have communication for this. I don't know. Maybe if there are other opinion on this, Clement or Estelle may help me, but these are very independent inscriptions or graffiti.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachik. Yes, we presented a paper about the communication between different languages in Vienna 2 months ago with Estelle. And we studied a part of a column, of the 5th column of the facade of the Holy Sepulchre. And we draw all the inscription on this very small area, 50 centimeters high, to study the palimpsest and the superposition of writings. And we add Armenian, Arabic, Russian, Greek, Latin in this small area. And our conclusion is that people from these different communities didn't know each other and maybe didn't understand, as Veronique was saying this morning, we only see what you are looking for. And people, for example, a Western pilgrim was not aware if he wasn't very well educated in the 15th century that other ways of writing existed, and he wasn't able to identify an Arabic graffito, etc. So that is for the how do we say, late medieval period, when there was still a multiculturalism in Jerusalem, a multi-religious life, but I think it was different during Crusader period because the communities were much more important, and we have this phenomenon on inscriptions in Bethlehem, which are multilingual inscriptions, but it's not graffiti. So yes, I don't know.
That's very simple. I don't know that helps or confuses things. I've complicated writing. Then you just start thinking about the difference between communication and interaction. Which, I mean, I think that's an interesting answer to. Right. Because one can interact, that really communicates. On the other hand, you do communicate something like that, and it can be nonverbal. And after all, the very fact of scratching a surface, you are interacting even with the materiality of the surface. So you can also say you're communicating with the space, with the church, with the fresco, with the building, with the space, right? So
yes, but the question is the fact of being conscious or not of interacting with people. Because we don't know, and for instance, the graffito Rachik shows this morning of this Armenian graffito overwritten by an Arabic one. It's for an Arabic writer who writes on an Armenian graffito. It's not as clear as writing on a plain surface. So if he was, if he was aware of the meaning of the text under it, maybe he would not have written on it.
I saw someone putting scratching on it. So we have this continuously adding so views of surface for this egg. The Jerusalem is maybe another case. I don't know.
You know what? What's interesting, if I can jump to today, I have gone with students to a place in Warsaw, which is a graffiti park. Now I'm talking contemporary graffiti made with spray cans. And when you arrive at that place, which is a recycled space, and it's now reserved for that, it's called the graffiti park. I think it's no more since then, but you're even given the rules that you're not supposed to do it over someone else. And in fact, you get there and you're like, okay, where are we going? And then, okay, I don't think they can see us, so let's go. And because it's so full. But it's interesting that in hip hop graffiti, I mean, contemporary graffiti, there are rules. You're not supposed to vandalize someone else's inscription.
This happens even in online graffiti. But I'm not going to. Yes. Sorry.
I had a brief question to Elisa. Was it there? When you were talking about like these caskets, which when before the relics are placed in, like you have the graffiti on top of it, like the names on the side, but also on the bottom. Like, would the sacredness of the object matter? Like after the relics are placed in, like would it then matter?
So you're not talking about the writings, but the object itself, right?
Yeah, like how would the because we're talking about materiality, like how would it then affect it? Because it
well, actually, relics were kind of considered somehow able to transmit the sacredness of the being to which they belonged. Well, like just in a few words, but yes, this was really through physical proximity. They were in a way, according to medieval Christians, affect the thing or person they came in touch with. So that was true, especially for the container that was not just made to contain them in a very pragmatical point of view, but was there like involucre, and which was itself very often considered, as we know from literature's text, a sacred object itself as a relic. That's why sometimes inside reliquaries, then we also have to make a distinction between the types of reliquaries, but that's not useful now. But sometimes inside reliquaries, as in the capsule that I have shown, you find other reliquaries. And if you really look also the written documentation that we associated with this object, also the familiarity used to assert whose relics were inside, sometimes really blunder the limits between the relics and the reliquary. So it's really a complex matter, what you ask, but also super important because, of course, the name, also were means through which people could benefit from the proximity with the relics and thus the sacred dimension. So it is all intertwined. That's,
Something, and that's the principle of relics. They're basically like radioactive material. It kind of really oozes out. And that is why, as Elisa was saying, the container of a relic becomes itself. And you get those series of containing, it's like Russian dolls, to the point that you can produce your own relics by contact. And that's what people from very early on would do. In St. Peter's, in old St. Peter's, they would let little pieces of fabric dry. Right, there was an opening over where now is the baldacchino, but there was an opening where you would tie a little piece of fabric on thread, let it go down until it would touch St. Peter's coffin, and that would become a relic. You would take it with you.
there were no specific objects that, you know, were relics and other not, that the relic was made in a way by the setting, the container, a tradition. So also, well, it is. I mean, the relic could be a reliquary itself, considered a relic. It was not a specific type of object that was, for instance, bones or hair or whatever else. It could be also, there are no specific nature attached to the relics itself as an object. Reliquaries, to empty reliquaries were relics because they acquired the status of relics, and that's something that also vary considerably from in different contexts. That was actually what I was studying when I was a postdoc in Utrecht with Marco Mostert, and then the notion of relic is also contextual. There is no a generally valid definition of relics. It depends on the context. And then if you actually read text and vitae and examine the material culture of different archaeological contexts or societies, you realize how wide and a bit slippery the concept of relic is. So yeah, but that's the normative. But that's, yeah, that's well, yeah, but then it also changes from the early Middle Ages to the late Middle Ages, and then anyway. Yeah, well, it's a bit needed to be discussed.
Okay, but we have at least 5 more questions. So please, I have to respect the first one from Antonello. I keep the microphone, okay?
Okay, first of all, thank you all very much for your much interesting papers. And I just would love to fly back to Nubia because I have a couple of comments on, a couple of your comments during your paper. The first one regards the clusters of graffiti inscriptions, whatever. You said that in some cases there is a sort of a reaction that leads to the tracing of more graffiti, more inscriptions, and this is interesting because I think that more than a reaction, there is some sort of attraction, in the sense that graffiti can attract more graffiti in one specific spot, and the case you showed us of Ego and the Cago, it creates some sort of chain, inscriptional chain. And that's, yeah, I just wanted to add this little thing. The second one, which is to me really interesting, is about the whitewashing of the first layer of inscriptions in the church of Banganarti, probably. Yeah, the same. Yeah. Complete war. Okay. Interested with cover, yeah. And this is, to me, really interesting because it brings us to another problem. If there was, in general, of course, some kind of controlling agency of authority on which, could somehow or not regulate this epigraphic habit, because when you whitewash a wall to let other people use to create more room, to create, to be more precise, a new room to inscribe new graffiti, of course, there is some kind of controlling agency. There must have been, absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And depending on the payment, you're allowed to put your mark here or there. And for those who were unable to write, this person could have executed the inscription there. And for those who wanted the inscription painted, he provided tools, brush or pen and paint, and ink. Yeah, there was a fabric, graffiti fabric.
I think it's interesting because in many other contexts, probably there was no one taking care of, let's say, the arrangement of walls to receive more or new graffiti. I mean, in Banganarti or in more other contexts, we know, of course, that there was someone taking care of this aspect, but probably in other contexts there was no actual regulation of this practice. No, that's all. Thank you.
Yourself, otherwise.
Okay, thank you. So, allora, a question to Estelle or Clément about the Cenacle in Jerusalem. Okay, when do the oldest graffiti you found on the wall of Cenacle date back? Could they help us with the datation of the architectural structure?
It's not linked. The two questions, the two aspects are not connected. The Cenacle has been built either in the second half of the 12th century, so during the lighting. Now I know. That's why I say either. Yeah, either on the 13th century, during the decades, it was under the Latin control. Yeah, but we don't know. Art historians are not sure. But it's not, so it's not connected with graffiti, because graffiti are later, I think, the first.
It depends. For Arabic graffiti, I think maybe we have one from the Crusader period on one of the marble columns, but I have to check because I don't know, because it's only a paleographical datation, I think. But after all the graffiti we have written with charcoal or painted are from the 1430s, nothing before. Yes. And everything starts in 1430s.
Quarter of the 13th century. They are closely related to the acceso.
Yes, but the Latin has only a decade during the 13th century, after the Treaty of Jaffa in 1229. So just a decade. Perhaps it was during this decade, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
And are very different from the Crusader architecture of the first part before Hattin, for example, Belloir and so on. It seems more similar to the second phase of Crusader architecture, like Crac Chevalier or Acre and so on. Yeah. I don't know.
But unfortunately, here inscription and graffiti are not very helpful.
We have
I was the fourth.
Fourth, and the third.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Professor Tedeschi, since you observed that medieval graffiti can represent calmo. Okay, sure. Since you observed that medieval graffiti can represent individual acts of group belonging, would you say that observation also applies to Pompeian graffiti scratched by slaves? Yes.
Well, what do you mean?
In a sense, I'm interested because I'm writing my thesis about Pompeian graffiti, and one of the groups that I am investigating are slaves, and so I thought perhaps I could conceptualize, theorize that they are expressing their group identity in some sense.
Well, my paper was about medieval and early modern graffiti. So I've never really thought about slaves graffiti in Pompeii. I find it difficult to apply the ideas that you I mean, my paper was raised some questions about medieval graffiti, basically, and it's a little methodologically, I find it a little dangerous to apply the results of research that someone does in a given chronological span to a totally different context.
Okay, that's understandable.
So I cannot answer you because I should think about it.
Yeah.
Basically.
Okay, let's talk tomorrow then maybe.
Can I? So I was surprised of the amount of spelling mistakes we found in your case in Nubia, in ancient Greek graffiti. And I was wondering if in your contact with Latin graffiti or inscriptions, because also in the inscriptions we found in the catacombs, there were also many spelling mistakes. And I was wondering why it is like this, and if in Latin cases happens the same, or in Armenian, if it's problem of the people who were writing graffiti. To whoever came in contact with Latin, or
I can try to answer. Well, the concept of mistakes is by itself dangerous concept to adopt, because what do you mean by mistake from a linguistic point of view? What we are dealing with is material which represents one of the very few witnesses of spoken language. So one thing is the literary language, one thing is the spoken language. At the same time, when Cicero wrote his work, at the same time, there were people who spoke a totally different Latin. And we are lucky enough to have some idea of this kind of Latin, thanks to the material like the graffiti in Pompeii and other graffiti. For example, in Britain, we have examples of British Latin, which is unbelievably interesting. No, 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 not at all. It is really, I mean, in the Ficciones from Bath and from many other places in Britain, you have Celtic. Or, so, I mean, the concept of mistake is a mistake.
French was not, I mean, any of us who've read medieval French, I mean, wasn't standardized. But I want to add something else, though. This is from the maker's point of view. So I kind of dabble in art. I must confess, I'm terrible. I mean, I've been keeping a diary, and I tend typically to write the date. I've developed this kind of way of writing. It's in capitals, kind of inspired by, you know, I write. So basically what I'm telling you is when you're writing a word, and this applies to carving, in a painstaking manner, when you have to like carve one letter, then it takes you quite a while. It's remarkably often that I skip one letter. Because as it's different from writing, kind of flowing, but when you're doing painstakingly with lots of different strikes, and even more if you're carving, letter by letter, all of a sudden you skip letters. And even this, in a situation where you have abbreviations, and of course words are abbreviated, but you generate mistakes like that. So I must say I'm very become aware of how, when you're carving, you lose track. It's such a different writing situation than when you are comfortably writing, even with your quill. And that happens even when you're writing with a quill, because let's not forget, you've started your word and all of a sudden you have to get more ink. And that somehow, interrupts your graphic train of thought. So all kinds of things we don't understand anymore because we don't have to practice that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that again, of course, people didn't have dictionaries, so they could check on a concept of correct, or autocorrect. Some communities, though, did teach their own, way of spelling. This is how we, the Carthusians, spell, but, and they have debates about what they do, but they're talking about very small communities. And texts like names are particularly fluid. William Shakespeare even, his name appears in multiple different ways. Nobody agreed how to spell those kinds of words. So yeah, it's the modern concept of correctness is just not applicable, but it's an awfully interesting subject.
Just something, because it's actually you are speaking probably about orthograph. It's the same word in English. Yeah, orthography, spellings. And it's an invention of the 19th century. Yeah, in France by Jules Ferry with a school, obligatory school for all the children, but it doesn't exist before. And French can be written in different manner, and Latin, of course, and as you said, the names. William, Guillermus, William, etc., etc. So.
Okay, the first question that I have is from actually Bernardo, and is for Veronique, and it's about restoration of graffiti. Would it be possible on frescoes?
To restore the graffiti?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, just the other day in the catacombs, we did see that one of the inscriptions, one of the carvings, right, that had been painted over. So what are we talking about? Okay, restoring frescoes. How do you restore the fresco while allowing the graffito to still be present? I mean, this is the can of worms of even the idea of restoration, of conservation, right? I mean, so that too is a continuum. Do you touch that work of art to stabilize it, because you know that if you don't do anything, it'll be in worse condition in 2 years, in 2 days, in 2 minutes, in a century. So that's the first thing. And as you know, nowadays, there's very strict criteria for restoration. It has to be reversible, because now people are aware that the technology and the philosophy changes. And so you don't want to be stuck with something that was done that really, I mean, and then there's, you know, whenever you do it, and then also at times you restore, because if you have a big chunk of a painting that's missing, that's all you see. So that's why that's the other big rule of contemporary conservation / restoration, is that you fill in, but a tratteggio. So when you look up close, you know it's so, because you don't want to cheat. You don't want to do something that then is perceived as being done by the artist. Well, it's not. So, but you see, the problem with restoration, conservation, whatever you want to call it, it's also, and we talked about that in the catacombs, what are you restoring? I mean, objects, any kind of creation being used, being existing, evolves, is modified by people, by the weather, by age, right? By processes of natural aging. So if you're going to be fix, right, somehow intervening, let's say, on that object, where do you go? Do you try to, I mean, this is the whole issue with Notre Dame, right?
Yeah, of course, but on the graffiti itself, would it be possible to do something similar? That was the question.
So
like, how can you restore something like that? How can you maintain something like that, as in case of like the Armenian graffiti that has been scribbled on already?
So the question is, what are you trying to do as you intervene? What I can tell you is what I've seen done in some museums is finding ways to make the graffiti more readable. See, because one thing is the basic thing is stabilizing the object, right? You don't want it to totally decay and fall apart. That's kind of, you feel this responsibility as steward of a piece of heritage. You have to kind of allow it to survive for future generations. That's the most basic thing, which in and of itself is highly difficult and problematic, because by doing that, you might be also losing some material. And again, if there's been some sort of accretions to it, who are you to judge what is, I mean, okay, I've lost the book. I don't know where it is. I'm really annoyed, but I used to own this book on the prehistoric carvings in on the slope of the it's near La Brigue. It's a Le Mont des Merveilles. Yeah, the Vallée des Merveilles, with this prehistoric carvings. And then the Romans left inscriptions, graffiti. Carves right on the slope, on the stones. Then came the shepherds, and shepherds are bored, they write things. And so I had this book, which was pretty much on the prehistoric carvings. So far, so good. Important ensemble. I think they were okay with the shepherd's carving. Beatrice Frankel was just here, knew someone who wrote her dissertation on the shepherd's carvings. And that book then reproduced a photo of Mickey Mouse being completely shocked, because how dare they, right? Vandalism. But if you think about it as a continuum, where do we, and I know, Stell, that's what Beatrice reported about your conference, because I was talking about that with her, is really the question of where do you stop history? Or where does the present, or right? I mean, and when you're conserving something, it's for the future. And there's always the question of what will the future think about this? So does that answer? So one thing that I've seen done in museums is, for instance, when they're on works of art and they're not totally readable, and that also means that that process of patrimonialization that I was mentioning is really underway. A friend sent me pictures of even videos of where you had wall paintings with some graffiti, and they were projections over them that allowed you to read them better. Because there's also that when you have layer after layer, you want to be able to kind of peel them. So such technology might allow you to see, okay, there was this one and then this one came over it. So this is more than restoration, rather than restoration, I would say it's interpretation. It's ways of presenting it in a way that, you know, didactically makes it more accessible to the viewer.
It's just to give an example, in the Nativity Church in Bethlehem, there were several years of restoration. Now it's finished. It began in 2013. And at the beginning, it was not planned to restore graffiti. Okay, but fortunately, by chance, there was an art historian in the committee, and he said, okay, if you don't restore, I sent a message to UNESCO to say, oh, so, okay, they said, okay, we will find money to restore. Okay, so they restore all the graffiti. But the problem, actually, it was, at the beginning, they said, okay, we restore historic graffiti. But graffiti are still now. So finally, they restore all the graffiti. But without, I had to say, without the help of graffitologists, epigraphers. So sometimes there are mistakes in this case with restoration because he didn't know. We have several layers of writings in different writings, so Arabic, Syriac, Georgian, Armenian, etc. So sometimes it's difficult to know. It's a stroke to the Arabic writing or to the Latin writing. So, but we have to say it's a really good work of restoration, and it's very interesting because I think we have not so many right now, not so many cases of restoration of graffiti. Yeah, because it was on, most of them were on the marble columns, okay, and it was completely dark. So we couldn't see the graffiti. And they have to to clean the dirt, and the writing appears. But yeah.
You take of it, and since we're dealing
with
size, you are actually less than the actual carbon.
Yeah, and it was it was not only inside, it was the painted with charcoal, with hematit, so several techniques.
And you see, there were people who immediately complained and said, you removed the layer of Michelangelo's fresco, which is not true because there was, as I said, that actual varnish. The proof that there was varnish, by the way, is very easily on the face of Eve, on the creation of Eve. We know the varnish was transparent at first because there was, when you look at photos, because that varnish then sucked the dirt and and so there was a triangle on her face and you could see that they missed part of it, and so of course where there was varnish it became brown, and where there was no varnish it was brighter, and it was right in front of her face. The proof that the varnish was transparent when it was. So what was really removed was just superficial. But the problem is when you clean, you remove something. Yeah.
And if I can have my personal question to Professor Tedeschi, emotionology mentioned in the opening. I totally see why emotion as a vehicle for agency, but how can we find emotion in these texts? Because Barbara Rosenwein works with a different kind of text where continent is the key, word is the key. How? With graffiti.
Yeah, that's why I devoted a large part of my paper to the problem of who wrote. And from this point of view, I find it too simplistic to say it was John. It was because from this point of view, I find that the standardization of graffiti talks about a sort of common language, which was used by people, of course, we can say individuals, but individuals who recognized themselves in the values of a community. So, graffiti do not often talk about emotions. We have to see behind. That's the...
Where? Because where? Because you're working with a very, like, you can't see it in the end, you can't see it, like, you can understand in words. Then is the place,
yes.
Is it the location, the place where to look for emotions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, many things together. Allora, let's start from the place, from the location. That's very meaningful. So if I find a large number of names, a name, you can say, doesn't say anything, a name by itself. By itself, I could use it only to know, for example, what kind of onomastics was spread in a given society. But that's not what I'm looking for. I mean, this is interesting, of course, but behind and beyond this level of knowledge, you can add much more, because if you put together John, William, and so on, a large number of individuals who go to a given place and leave their names there. Why do they do so? Because they recognize something valuable in that place. That place is, we can say, and Beatrice has gone, but a writing art. And it is a writing act in a place of memory. So we have to understand all these. I mean, the text is just a name, perhaps, but we have to understand the text in the perspective of the act. I don't know if I...
Thank you for the reply, but I think that then is not expandable to all graffitis. Not
all graffiti are.
Yeah. Yes, no, I do believe, but as I said in the beginning, emotion is like a vehicle of, like, is the way, is what leads us to agency. You don't do things because you have only to do them.
You mentioned Barbara Rosenwein. Maybe one day it'll be published. I don't know. Our friend Antonio is taking a sweet, but I have an article on, unfortunately in Spanish, if it comes out, on graffiti and emotional communities. So that's different. I mean, Rosenwein is really talking about emotional communities. So there's that. Then, of course, not all graffiti are doing the same thing. I think it became clear today, right? But I was mouthing to you the act, and then Carlos said that. First of all, think about that. And maybe that's where all graffiti are, perhaps a little that. Think about what it means to actually physically alter a surface. there's emotions in any physical act. You cannot do something that is embodied, that is physical, without some, I mean, it's your guts speaking. You can't be, I mean, right? We modern people, of course, we are so dissociated when it comes to, you know, brain and body, except we know, I mean, we're constantly, what's the term, you know, somatizing. I mean, think about the skin. The skin, I mean, we blush, we break out in right? It's things coming out. And so imagine the movement, right? Things come out to your skin, then you're writing, you're incising, right? You're interacting with the surface. Of course, it's emotional. On the marble, right? As you're entering a space, as you're coming out of a space, right, you're carving in a special place. It must have meant something to actually touch even and then carve. So it's emotional. Then you put, at least I can speak for my case, because I mean, Carlo was showing how different graffiti are in terms of, you know, very formulaic. There's a sort of detachment in the early medieval period. And then things change with the later Middle Ages when it becomes more emotional. Then you put that into the context of the culture. For instance, the devotional culture, which is all about emotionality. I mean, you hear about people weeping all the time. You're asked to think about things. And here's the thing, you know, the use of images. Images were like your training wheels. Of course, the ideal was to have a devotion without images, but who could do that, right? But the goal is to kind of really feel, to cry. I mean, tears. I've written on tears, right? So then you put that into the context of how people were actually living and thinking and relating with objects, and then there's emotions, even if the inscription itself in its content feels extremely factual. You know, today it rained. Okay, but why are you actually defacing? And frankly, of course, back to conservation, that's the thing. If you keep, at least in my case with graffiti on frescoes, if you keep writing graffiti, one day the fresco disappears. You know, and that's why, you know, what Foucault wrote about how history basically keeps, I mean, the whole thing about the Kafka story, where your body becomes, right, the surface that's tortured with history writing on it. There's that. I mean, right, okay.
For cinema is Greek word, very difficult to translate. It means something like act of adoration. The type of inscription is for cinema, act of adoration of this and this person. And this person is the writer. So frequently the writers add names of other people. So the inscription reads, the act of adoration of me, Dionysius, and my wife, Dionysia, and my 3 children, this, and my father-in-law, this and this, and my mother-in-law, this and this, and my neighbor, this and this. And you see very beautiful relations, familiar, erotic, neighbor relations. But the most beautiful example comes from Eastern Desert. A soldier, a Roman soldier, writes, for cinema of me, Tiberius Julius, and my horse. You know, it's yours.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of the word proskinesis.
Yeah, but proskinesis is something else. This is
No, but right,
it's
but it's interesting that
it's the act of giving homage to a god or to a king, and proskima is just an act of writing.
Yeah, but writing becoming almost physical then.
Yeah. It is. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I think you're right to be skeptical. This is a very, very productive analytical framework. But on the other hand, we have to remember, okay, so we have graffiti in churches because the churches survive. Okay, what about all the other places that don't survive, you know? So actually, I think, you know, it's always good to be skeptical. I encourage you to carry on and ask these difficult questions.
But that's different than that. Labeling. Labeling, but that's not labeling. I don't know, but this was just related to other kinds of objects that makes it different than us. Right, we are just, it was just related to we actually don't have much divide compared to how much we do back then.
I think we have.
I have a question for Estelle and Clement, although perhaps others can also answer about the distance between the people who request graffiti to be made for them and the ones who actually make it. Specifically, in your case, the pilgrims were not physically making the coats of arms or the inscriptions in the wall. Does that change any of the meaning of it? Does that have certain implications?
It's a very interesting question because for a lot of people, graffiti is a personal act and is graffiti for many people is autograph. And we have some evidences that it was not often the case. For example, in collective inscriptions written in the same hand, or for example, for groups of coat of arms, which are the same size, in the same technique. And we know that noblemen were not going on a ladder, on scaffolding, to carve or to paint themselves. So yes, there is a real difference because on one side you can make the act yourself of incising, and it's maybe the gesture and the fact of carving which is even more important than the result. And on the other hand, you may think that finally the result is more important. But as we said, there is a very wide range of graffiti. So maybe for graffiti for commemoration after an offering, for instance, in Bethlehem Church, we think that the big crest of arms painted, which are called graffiti, but they are not graffiti, were painted by someone expert in painting this kind of thing. And the fact it was, yes, it was important to commemorate an offering. It's an hypothesis. So if it was not so important, if the person did it himself or not. On another end, maybe when it was near relics, etc., it was maybe more powerful, more efficient to do it itself, and the act of writing was at least as important as a result. I don't know. This is great.
Thank you. Yes.
For Elisa. But it's for Elisa and a little bit also for Estelle and Clement. Going back to your paper, I noticed a very different level of competence between the large inscription, which was filled with something, I don't know. Yeah. Ah, and the other ones. So I wonder if this inscription, and in this case, it's a very formal inscription, and it's an inscription which was clearly made by a competent hand. And well, I noticed that there are some, how to call them, some jeux de lettres, very, and I wonder if this could be a sign. Yes, and then that's one part of the story, and the second part of the story is all the rest. All the other names that added, someone by himself, someone else in groups of names, but yeah.
I got the question, and thank you. That was also something else I have not really cut off from my paper, but changed. First of all, because we cannot be sure of whether the filling, the plaster filling, is contemporary with the engraving or no. So I showed an inscription on the lid of that Lipsanoteca I show, and then it was really beautifully carved with the letters filled with plaster, cement. And I have wonderful picture of this object, but I did not see it yet. And I don't know whether it was an original decoration. So this is such an important element to hypothesize of whether they wanted to make, for example, the letter more visible. So if this is and then we also have to think of the function of the object as an object that was meant to be hidden forever. So, but still, even in the little marble slabs that were placed inside the relic containers, sometimes we have the use of colors for the letter. So the fact that an object was placed in an invisible position does not exclude that still some devices could be used to enhance the visibility of script. But I'm not sure whether the plaster is contemporary with the technique, and well, because because the jeu de lettres, as I meant it.
I didn't finish my. Well, okay. My point is these. Sorry. The skills of the writer, but also the. Do we have inscriptions in the area which may look like them, which may look like this peculiar inscription, that, or we have to look for a different origin? For example, from southern France, and I think we cannot exclude this possibility, particularly in this case, because the history of this place is strongly related to and the architecture of Santa Maria in Piedichianti is a very peculiar architecture which shows very strong connections to southern France. So, to France, anyway.
Yeah. Well, on the Lipsanoteca that I have analyzed, the one from Spain and southern France, I did find more formal inscription, but not such a products. So I would say no, as far as I know, but I have to look still into this material thoroughly and make also other comparisons with.
But I'm not talking about the other Lipsanoteca.
No, I understood.
Yeah.
I understood.
I'm talking about a comparison with the formal inscriptions,
yes,
yeah, of southern France.
To say that is
Not really.
Well,
Not so now.
No, not well, not that much. In the
Yes, yes. But I mean, if I have to think about an example of epigraphy which looks like that.
It's more
Yeah.
like in the French, but I have to look at this and
Yeah.
just to say that it's such a unique example
Yeah.
also within that kind of object.
Yeah.
But I will certainly make some comparison with southern west inscription from southwest France, from the northeast of Spain, and the distinctive writing, of course, of
Yeah.
manuscripts. But I also think that there were also well, the fact that they were that such jeux de lettres were used, not even in all description, only in just a portion of it. So that was also me, because why you have to start writing something and then you so my at the end, when I said that I changed my mind in relation to the jeux de lettres, was because it's not something uniform within the text. It's something that you can observe only in relation to some parts, and maybe it's as related with the space thing. But with no, is a symbolic. It's something that also the economy space, but also the image of a name, something that is actually that you make something less readable, but you enhance the impact, the visual impact of that thing. So, but that maybe we are going a little far.
The area of Toulouse, for example.
Hello, I'm sorry, but it's very, very late and I have to cut the session. Sorry for this. Okay. And let me say thank you to all speakers and